Spirituality, Theology and Health seminar. Some new faces here today, which is lovely. Welcome to those of you who have not been before. And it's a great pleasure to welcome back Fraser, who's well known for his work over many years now as Starbridge lecturer in Cambridge, and then since retirement he's been continually active in writing and research and all sorts of things, some of which I imagine he'll be telling you about today. And visiting professor, is that correct? Yes. Yes. So thank you, amidst all your many retirement activities, for coming to join us and to share with us. You're the only person, I've said this before, who's annually given a lecture on this seminar programme over its last 8, 9 or 10 years. So we're delighted that you've adopted us, and we feel like you're a member of the family now. Yes. So welcome. Good.
Thank you very much. It's a privilege. I enjoy my annual trips to Durham to spend time with you. So, and what I want to talk about today is the role of the body in religion. I'm trying to write a book about that. As with all academic authors writing books, I'm less far on with it than I'd hoped to be at this point of giving the seminar, but it's sort of emerging out of the mist, and I want to share some of those emerging thoughts with you. I'm going to be talking mainly out of the, and with reference to the Christian tradition, a few other references to other traditions, but Christianity is my tradition and it's what I know about, so that's why I talk about it. I don't have any sense of superiority about it. Christianity is very ambivalent about the body. I mean, if you look at the core Christian doctrines, then they're pretty positive about the body. I mean, there's a belief that the creation around us, including the physical body, is God's creation. God was incarnate in Jesus in a human body. There is communion with Jesus, with his body and blood in the Eucharist. I've recently become aware that in the Eastern Orthodox tradition of praying with icons, it's a very physical kind of prayer, and there's a sense of really engaging with the body of the icon, that the icon is actually looking at you. This is a real physical presence that you're with in prayer with icons. There's a long tradition of healing of the body in Christianity, not a continuous history, a bit patchy, quite strong in the early centuries, and a revival in the last 150 years or so. But quite a good tradition of healing of the body and a belief in the resurrection of the body. So that's a lot of positive stuff about the body. But on the other hand, there is quite a lot of moral panic about the body, and it's mainly to do with sex, I think, and how the sort of physical desires that people have, sexual desires, can be corrupting. And some of the church fathers, Durham for example, get quite carried away about the dangers of the body. So we're sort of caught in this ambivalence, I think, partly a theological doctrinal celebration of the body, running strangely alongside this moral panic about what physical preoccupations do to people, and leading in some parts of the Christian tradition to the view that you need to transcend the body. Now, for much of the Christian centuries, we've been operating with a body-soul dualism. And I think from different points of view, many people are now coming to think that's unsatisfactory. And most philosophers of religion, I think, have wanted philosophical theologians have wanted to rethink that in the post-Yule years. Really in the aftermath of philosophers having a rethink about the mind. There has in secular thought been a kind of dualism of body and mind, and the Christian dualism of body and soul is sort of much like that, perhaps almost equivalent to it for some people. And in post-war philosophy, I think there's been a strong movement to get away from the idea that the mind is a thing comparable to the body. There are sort of two substances in human beings, so the body and there is a mind. Of course we have mental properties and powers, but that's not to say that there's a thing that we can call the mind in the way that there seems to be a thing that we call the body. And influenced by that new post-war philosophy of mind, a lot of philosophical theologians are wanting to rethink the theological inheritance of body and soul. I think there's also a confusion about the nature of the difference between body and soul. People often take distinctions and turn them into divisions, things that are completely separate. I'm quite keen on the poet and philosopher Coleridge, and this is one of Coleridge's standard philosophical points, that people take distinctions and turn them into divisions, as though there was no connection between them. I think body and soul makes a useful distinction, but I think you get it wrong if you turn that into a division, and I think a lot of people have. And it's the body and soul division that is a problem, not the conceptual distinction between body and soul. But this twofold distinction between body and soul is quite problematic from a New Testament point of view. And I think perhaps I'm hoping there aren't any really erudite New Testament scholars here, and Chris and I were talking over tea about how biblical scholars get very upset when other people in theology faculties start talking about the Bible. My main source for this part of my remarks is Michael Welker, distinguished German theologian, but systematic theologian, writing about Pauline anthropology, and what does a mere systematic theologian know about Pauline thinking about anything? But I mean, Welker's main point is that Paul's thinking about the human being is much more complex than just the distinction between body and soul. There's more going on than that. And he introduces quite a number of other Pauline terms. I'm not sure that I want to go with all the possible terms you can get out of Paul, but I do think that you need at least a fourfold schema rather than a twofold one to make any sense of things. I think you need to make a distinction between soul and spirit, and I think it's fairly clear that Paul uses those in different ways. Pneuma, spirit, and psyche, soul, are not the same thing. And in the early centuries, I think Christians made that distinction between spirit and soul, but then during the first millennium, there was a church council that decided that this was a distinction that could be dropped, and sort of opted for a twofold rather than a body and soul way of looking at the human being, and elided the distinction between soul and spirit. I think that was a mistake. There are a couple of people who have been quite influential with me in my intellectual journey who persuaded me of that. One is the German Christian polymath Rudolf Steiner, founder of the so-called anthroposophical movement, quite a mouthful, who thought the distinction between soul and spirit was really important and need to be rediscovered. So does the rather maverick Jungian psychologist James Hillman, his take on the distinction is that sort of the soul takes you deep, whereas the spirit wants to soar. These are actually taking you in different, distinct directions, and you can't just elide these as though they were the same thing. But that's not really what I'm here to talk about this afternoon. I think we also need to make a distinction between body and flesh, and St. Paul clearly makes that distinction between body, soma, and flesh sarx. We talk about the resurrection of the body in the creed, and I think a lot of people take that to mean the resurrection of the flesh. But I don't think that's what Paul means when he talks about the resurrection. In 1 Corinthians 15, which is his most systematic attempt to unpack what he does mean by resurrection, the language he uses is body language, it's not flesh language. And he's talking about the resurrection body as a particular kind of body, not a particular kind of flesh. So I think there's been quite a lot of confusion that's arisen from aligning body and flesh. It seems to me an important distinction. There's a rough analogy with the distinction between anatomy and physiology. I mean, anatomy is about the sort of structure of the body, the bits. The physiology is a more systemic, functional view of the body. It's a somewhat similar kind of distinction. Rudolf Steiner makes a distinction between the physical body and what he calls the life body or etheric body. I think that's roughly the distinction that St. Paul is making between sarx and soma. So I mention all this because I think it helps to sort out quite a lot of the confusions about body and soul if you recast it in a fourfold distinction of spirit, soul, body and flesh, rather than a body-soul dualism, and if you keep in mind the point that Coleridge would want to make, that these are just distinctions, that there is no real division between any of these. Human beings are all of these, and there is sort of interpenetration between them. Each one influences the other. They're not separate from one another. So I make that by preamble, and I think it'll sort of be useful background for what I want to say. I generally want to emphasize the importance of the body in religion. I mean, sometimes people talk about as though religion was a spiritual matter. It seems to me it's a very physical matter in all sorts of ways, and that religion started with embodied practices. Most anthropologists recognize this, that religion starts with things like trance dancing, with physical practices. And the so-called cognitive science of religion, I think, has spread quite a bit of confusion and misinformation about this, and has tried to put it around that religion starts with cognition. This seems to me wholly speculative and without any scientific foundation at all. The only way you can salvage that is if you use religion in a rather restricted way, and then if you say that trance dancing isn't really religion at all, it's just a sort of prelude to religion, and you don't get religion proper until you get cognition, then I think you can make it true almost by definition that religion, in that rather narrow sense, starts with cognition. But religious practices, which are the seed corn, the practices which provide the seed corn from which religion comes, they are older than religious cognition, and I think trance dancing is the key development. I've been working for the last 3 years on a research project with Robin Dunbar in Oxford and his social brain theory, best known for Dunbar's number, and I'm not going to try and talk fully about that project here today, though I might do that on a future occasion, maybe next year, who knows. Trance dancing was a really valuable development in human evolution. It did various things. It helped with social bonding. Our primate ancestors had used mutual grooming as the main way of doing social bonding. which is a very lovely way of doing social bonding, but you can only bond with sort of 4 or 5 other creatures by mutual grooming, and it's very time consuming. So, I mean, it's not an efficient way of doing social grooming, and it's one of the breakthroughs that Homo sapiens made, I think, that they found a way to do social bonding much more quickly with much larger numbers, and trance dancing was the key to that. And trance dancing produces massive collective endorphin release, and that delivers very, very good social bonding. You can still see that going on in the Bushmen of the Kalahari. So that's one important benefit of trance dancing. And another is healing. People who've worked with Bushmen in the Kalahari, I mean, if you ask them why they do trance dancing, the main reason is healing. If there is sickness, then their way of dealing with sickness is to do trance dancing, and then something happens to restore people to health. I don't think it's any great mystery how that happens. We know that endorphin release fine-tunes the immunological system, and if you get the immunological system working better, then people are likely to get better. That presumably is at a scientific level how it is that trance dancing delivers healing. But certainly primitive people in primitive cultures who do trance dancing look to it to deliver healing, and it seems to be moderately effective in doing that. It also thirdly produces experiences of the transcendent, and I think that is really interesting for the development of religion. It perhaps wasn't the reason why people got to do trance dancing. I mean, I think it probably became an established practice more for what it did for social bonding and healing than for the experiences of the transcendent that it delivered. But if you're getting vivid experiences of the spirit world as a result of trance dancing, then there is a growing interest in making sense of that world, and people start to weave stories about it, and then to think about it in more abstract conceptual ways as you move into more doctrinal forms of religion, which seem to come into on the scene when people move from hunter-gatherer societies into stable settlements. There's an interesting question about sort of people's attitude to the spiritual world, and what kind of domain people sense that is. And there's an interesting passage in a recent paper by Rowan Williams about this, where he says that we make a mistake if we imagine that pre-modern people thought there was another domain out there of which you could get kind of observational knowledge, that you could stand back and sort of study and understand this spiritual world that you were experiencing as a result of practices like trance dancing. He wants to emphasize that it's a much more participatory thing, that there is no sharp distinction between you, the observer, and the spirit world that you're observing. Rather, there is an expansion in your range of consciousness and an expanded reality in which you can participate. It's more a matter of expanded horizons of participation than an expanded reality that you can study as an observer. And I think that's an important corrective to a widespread misunderstanding of what's going on in primitive experiences of the transcendent. Let me move now from that evolutionary perspective to what's going on in some current practices. And as often finds when I get talking at Durham, I find I'm talking for longer than I thought I was going to, so I'll keep an eye on my watch. Yeah. There's a significant part of the Christian tradition which is engaged in ascetic practices, fasting, sleep deprivation, flagellation. And there's a sort of quite a peak of interest in this in the late Middle Ages, from the 13th century onwards. And that's a period when mysticism and asceticism comes together. Mystics and ascetics are the same people from the 13th century onwards. Before that, they seem to be different streams, but there's a particular point in history where they seem to coalesce, and people start to use ascetic practices as a way of development in the mystical path. That's not always what they say they are doing, and I think what ascetics say they are up to and why they think they are doing it is often at variance with what it is actually doing for them and why they are probably doing it. So there is quite a lot of stuff about identifying with Christ in his sufferings and suffering as Christ suffered in order to be at one with him. But actually I think there are other things going on, and as we look back on the ascetic phases of Christianity, I think you can see other things going on. There is, I think, a development of powers of self-discipline and self-control. There's been quite a revival of interest in willpower in psychology recently. For quite a long time, will was a word you couldn't really use in psychology at all, but there is now quite a rich psychology of willpower. Roy Baumeister has been one of the key figures in this, and developed what he calls a strength theory of willpower, in which he sees willpower as being very closely analogous to muscle development, that you develop muscles by using them, they get stronger with using them. In a similar way, he suggests people develop stronger willpower by exercising willpower, but as with physical exercise, you can't do it incessantly, and people need a break sometimes for rest and recovery. So he thinks that that applies with willpower as well, that you need a break from demanding exercises of willpower, and then you can return to it with renewed resources. And the church provides feast days as a kind of break from the kind of severe asceticism that you find in some monasteries, particularly in the Carthusian tradition, for example. So it seems, I think that's one reason why people engage in these sort of quite severe physical practices. There's another factor about religious experience, that I think people's religious experiences are heightened as a result of asceticism, in the same way as experiences of the spirit world came out of the physically very demanding practice of trance dancing. So I think heightened transcendent experiences, spirit experiences, come out living a life of sleep deprivation and fasting and flagellation. And endorphins come into this as well, not so much with fasting and sleep deprivation, but certainly with flagellation. When there is letting of blood, there is quite a rush of endorphin release. And in ascetic practices that involve bloodletting, I think people are, whether they know it or not, going for things that produce endorphin release. It's not rampant in the Christian tradition at the moment, but Opus Dei is still quite interested in bloodletting, using a scourge on the back and a cilice round the thigh. And I don't have a lot of contacts in Opus Dei, but I have enough to be aware that quite a lot of bloodletting is still going on in Opus Dei. And there's often a tension in religious movements between practitioners of bloodletting and flagellation who want to go further and further, and wise and cautious spiritual directors who want to rein them back from their excessive. It generally isn't that spiritual directors are saying you should push this further. That spiritual directors are usually saying you don't need to go to these extremes. But people get quite addicted to these experiences and themselves want to go further and further. I think there's something else going on psychologically about commitment. There's been a psychological theory around for the last 60 years about cognitive dissonance, that roughly the more costly something is, the more you believe in it, developed by a guy called Festinger. And I think there's something like that going on in these rather extreme ascetic practices, that the more severe and costly your religious discipline is, then the more committed to it you become. It sort of spirals upwards. The severity of the practices leads through cognitive dissonance to greater commitment. The more committed you are, the further you want to go with your ascetic practices. And there is, I think, a danger of it getting out of control, hence the need for wise and cautious spiritual directors who want to rein things in. This may seem largely a historical anachronism, and I think the late Middle Ages are the peak period of Christian asceticism, though it does, as I've said, survive in Opus Dei and probably some other conservative Catholic traditions. But I think something analogous to it has migrated across into the secular world, stripped of the religious rationale and motivation that it has in the Christian tradition. And when people engage sexually in BDSM practices, I think they're engaging in something which is quite analogous to Christian asceticism, and probably doing it for some of the same reasons. Some of the motivations are similar. What it does for people is similar, even though the context is very different, and the rationale given for it is very different. But leaving asceticism behind there's also for most religious people, a systematic use of body posture in religious practices, in prayer and similar observances. And the various faith traditions have slightly different emphases here. Christianity has more emphasis on kneeling than any other faith tradition. The Jewish tradition tends to emphasize standing. The Islamic tradition emphasizes bowing and prostration. The Hindu tradition has quite a bit of dancing, but a lot of postures that are associated with religious practices, particularly in the Abrahamic traditions, operate on the vertical up-down axis. There's an influential essay about body symbolism by Strauss, whose main idea is that the vertical dimension in body movements is about obedience and submission and authority, and the horizontal dimension is about reaching out, engaging with the world. And the religious traditions, in their different ways, all seem to emphasize that vertical dimension, whether it's kneeling or standing or prostration. These are sort of particular vertical positions. The Christian tradition doesn't make much use of prostration, though in the Catholic Church, priests often prostrate themselves in front of the altar in ordinations. The Eastern Orthodox Church makes more use of prostration than the Western Church, and a triple prostration is not an uncommon greeting in Eastern Orthodox Christians. And I was once surprised by a Macedonian Christian friend who did a triple prostration in front of me in King's Parade in Cambridge, rather to the astonishment of the tourists. I think it's the only time anyone's done a triple prostration in front of me. But often the Eastern and Western churches do something slightly different. What's going on psychologically here? It's partly that these particular postures, like kneeling, are an expression of the spiritual, psychological mood, attitude that people are in. But it also helps to induce that attitude. So I think there's both expression and induction going on in a kind of circle, really, that expressing submission before God in the form of kneeling is both an expression, but also further inculcates the mood of submission to God that you're expressing by doing that. So I think that's roughly the psychology by which this works. And probably Christians are quite variable in the extent to which they adopt particular postures in their spiritual practices. For example, in daily prayer, and I recall David Jenkins giving an interview when he was appointed Bishop of Durham, saying that he would be praying every day, but he wouldn't be doing much kneeling down by his bed to do it. So dispensing with those sort of postural aspects of prayer as unnecessary and irrelevant. And some people do dispense with them, and I wouldn't suggest they're necessary, but for quite a lot of people I think they are helpful. Psychologists got interested recently in what it calls embodied cognition, that the kind of interplay between physical posture and movement and thoughts and attitudes on the other. And as I've been saying, the postures both express and inculcate particular thoughts. There seems to be a two-way relationship between them. And then I think in the light of recent work on embodied cognition, we can develop a better understanding of what's going on in the sort of postural aspects of religious practices than people perhaps had before. People sometimes talk about the 4 E's of cognition. Embodied is one, enacted is another. Along with the emphasis on embodied cognition, there's been an emphasis on enacted cognition, that you understand things better, more deeply, in some ways, by doing things rather than just by thinking them. And there's quite a lot of current interest in religious enactment. And probably one of the most popular at the moment is pilgrimage. You find pilgrimages in most religious traditions, to Mecca, for example, in Islam. Christians go on pilgrimages to the Holy Land or to Santiago. And over the last few decades, there's been a considerable increase in the numbers of people going on pilgrimages. There's been a bit of research on the Santiago pilgrims in this country by Miguel Farias at Coventry University, amongst others. They're quite a mixed bag, the people who go on pilgrimages. They're not all deeply committed religious people. There are quite a lot of spiritual seekers who go on pilgrimages. They may become more religious as a result of going on pilgrimages, or they may not. But it seems to be a form of enacted religion that is attractive and appealing for those who would say they were more spiritual than religious. And people do get quite special experiences as a result of pilgrimage. It's often quite a physically painful activity. I mean, your feet get very blistered and that kind of thing. So walking, doing another day's walk with the state your feet are in is quite painful. And then it gets back to being a form of asceticism again, of sort of painful physical experience that you endure in a way that maybe cultivates willpower, as Roy Baumeister would put it. There's also the camaraderie, doing this together, which is probably something a little bit like the social bonding that you get with trance dancing in primitive humans. That's a really powerful kind of synchronized rhythmic movement, which is the best for collective endorphin release. But the sort of slow tramp of the feet in the company of other people on the way to Santiago is also, in its more subdued way, a synchronized rhythmic movement, and probably induces quite powerful social bonding for the people engaged in it. It also does something to your thought processes. I mean, most of us spend much of our time sort of daydreaming, wool gathering, with our thoughts starting here, there and everywhere, which is, for many people, I think, a slightly disagreeable experience, and people who take up meditation, I think, are often motivated by the desire to do something about that. I suggest that pilgrimage does something about it, that you get so physically weary and so caught up in this sort of endeavour to get to the place of pilgrimage, walking alongside other people with whom you are bonding very deeply, that you're actually not able to engage in much abstract meditation as you go. I think it subdues that in a way that meditative spiritual practices do. And there are various other sort of such practices, I think, which are quite transforming. The psychologist of religion, Ralph Hood, has done quite a lot of research on snake handling in primitive parts of America. Quite a challenging physical experience handling snakes. Scary. And people develop strong beliefs about the importance of doing it. It's done in a collective context, and quite people get probably. I mean, I don't think there've been any physiological recordings of what happens when people in people's bodies when they do snake handling, but there must be at least quite powerful adrenaline release. Maybe other neuropeptides are involved. And again, you're so caught up in what you're doing, there's not much opportunity for abstract discursive thought. There's a strong social context. Exercise of willpower, determination to get through this despite the obvious dangers you're having to fight your way through. So there's an interesting kind of enacted cognition here in which you are doing things that in some ways are substituting for thinking about religious things, and that gets you into a different part of the cognitive architecture. I think humans, probably uniquely among species, have sort of two different modes of central cognition. We have a sort of intuitive mode of central cognition that we largely share with our primate ancestors, and we have another more abstract discursive mode of cognition that's associated with our special capacities for language. And there are pros and cons for humans, I think, in having these two alternative ways of doing central cognition. I think these enacted religious practices shift the balance between them. They largely switch off what's going on in abstract discursive cognition and turn you over to the more older and intuitive kind of cognition. And I think quite a lot of current religious practices, in as far as they're appealing to people, do that. I think people get sort of weary with all their abstract discursive thought of the kind we do in seminars like this, and just want a break from that and to actually do something instead. So I've talked about embodied and enacted cognition. People also talk about extended cognition, part of the same family, and these are all associated with each other. I think once you get into embodied and enacted cognition, you have a sense of participating in some sort of broader consciousness, some experience of something beyond yourself, some experience of the transcendent. So the experience of extended cognition is another aspect of this. And also embedded cognition, the fourth of these four E's, it's a socially embedded cognition, as in trance dancing, as in people going on pilgrimage together. This is something that you're doing collectively. It's not just sort of private meditation. I had intended to say something about spiritual healing as well, but I've really taken all my time talking about this. Maybe I'll talk about spiritual healing on another occasion. It's something I'm very fascinated with, but just briefly, a few thoughts by way of conclusion. There is, as I mentioned at the start, a strong Christian tradition of seeking healing of the body. It's been a bit patchy. You find it at the beginning and more recently in the Christian tradition, though there's quite a gap in the middle in which it's not particularly important. It's interesting that there is a particular fascination with healing of the body in our time and the potential contribution of religion to that. I've done some research on a rather maverick, now faded 20th century religious movement in Bedford, the Panacea Society, that Chris also knows something about. Their leader, who they called Octavia, had this idea that Jesus, the Son of God, had a mission to save people's souls. She believed she was the daughter of God, and she thought it was her mission to save people's bodies. That this had not until now really been a central part of Christianity. I think there's something in the zeitgeist that finds healing of the body quite interesting and attractive, and as I said, I think it's one of the main reasons why primitive tribes in the Kalahari and elsewhere still do trance dancing. They do it seeking healing, and it does seem to deliver healing. We often call this spiritual healing. I'm not sure quite what we mean by that, and I think it's a slightly confused term. Some people are invoking sort of an external spiritual power in this healing, and there may be, I wouldn't want to rule that out, but whether or not that is the case, I think there is something that can be understood in purely human terms, that certain spiritual practices, individual and collective, are good for healing, and you can see it as a kind of extension of what medics call psychosomatic medicine. There is no mystery, I think, about the fact that mental processes can cause physical problems and can also alleviate physical problems. And in order to understand spiritual healing, I think we need some kind of expanded psychosomatic medicine that is connecting bodily function not just with the mind, but with psychospiritual aspects of human nature. And this is not to say that that's all that's going on in spiritual healing. And on science religion questions in general, I take a complementary perspectives approach. That there's a perspective that comes from theology, from the religious traditions. There's another perspective that comes from science, and these are complementary perspectives to understand what's going on. They don't have to be pitted against each other, and so developing a naturalistic understanding of what's happening in spiritual healing can stand on its own, or it is perfectly consistent with a strong view of the healing power of God. But those are just a few brief remarks about spiritual healing at the end, and I may come back to that on a future occasion. But that's enough for now, I think. Thank you very much.
Thank you.